Another powerhouse within the history of the church is going to be introduced right here in the Doctrine and Covenants in section 35, a man that most Latter-day Saints have heard of named Sidney Rigdon. He becomes extremely influential within our church as he becomes the first counselor in the first presidency of the church when it's organized, and he remains Joseph Smith's first counselor through Joseph's entire prophetic ministry. Sidney Rigdon will also become the primary scribe for the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible, and you'll see that suggested within the text of section 35 in verse 20 when the Lord tells Sidney Rigdon to write for Joseph. Well, what brought Sidney into the church? It's a great story, and it actually will influence, once again, the entire direction and history of the church. It comes about because of Parley P. Pratt, who was recently converted and baptized. And then, as you remember, in section 32, he was called to go on a mission and travel from New York and travel all the way to the borders, the Indian Territory, the borders of the Lamanites. Well, notice, on Parley's suggestion, they take this route here, and they want to pass through Mentor, Ohio, right by Kirtland, so that Parley can visit with his former preacher, his former spiritual leader, a man named Sidney Rigdon. Sidney was the spiritual leader of a large congregation of people who were looking for a restoration of the gospel. And these people mainly lived on a farm called the Isaac Morley Farm. And here's a picture of Isaac Morley right here. This farm was almost like a communal farm where they practiced having all things common, and dozens of families lived there. And they were looking for a restoration of the truth. Well, lo and behold, when these missionaries come along and start preaching as they're on their way to go visit the Lamanites, many of them accept the gospel. Dozens and dozens of them accept the gospel in Kirtland. It takes Sidney Rigdon a few days, but as he spends time with these missionaries and watches them preach and teach and sees the power and authority that they have, little by little, Sidney Rigdon realizes the truthfulness of the restored gospel. And he is also baptized as well, along with many other on the Isaac Morley farm. After Sidney's baptized, as it says here, he wanted to travel to New York with much anxiety to see Joseph Smith the seer, whom the Lord had raised up in these last days. Joseph finally meets with Sidney in New York in early December of 1830, and Rigdon was, quote, desirous to have the seer inquire of the Lord to know what the will of the Lord was concerning him, end of quote. The response is section 35 of the Doctrine and Covenants.